I love a broad margin to my life. Sometimes in a summer morning, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise till noon, wrapped in a reverie amidst the pines and hickories and sumacs in undisturbed solitude and stillness, while the birds sang around or flitted noiseless through the house, until, by the sun falling in at my west window, or the noise of some traveler's wagon on the distant highway, I was reminded of the lapse of time. I grew in those seasons like corn in the night, and they were far better than any work of the hands would have been. What are we to make of words like this? What if we met somebody who talked like this about sitting, wandering, letting the day go by, not even lifting a finger to work? We'd call them shiftless, lazy, good for nothing. Or perhaps one of the greatest minds in American history. Henry David Thoreau writes these words in the work Walden, a work in which he speaks of margin. He speaks of taking the time that many of us would not understand how he could, how we could possibly live such a life. Now, I'm not going to say that if you begin to live like Thoreau did, that you are going to become as prolific a writer and thinker as he was. However, it seems pretty clear that if he did not live that way, he would not be nearly as wise as he became. This week we continue our series on margin, asking where do we find margin in our time, in our schedules. If you weren't here last week, a reminder of the meaning of the metaphor of this word margin. Imagine with me a piece of notebook paper with the lines across, and you write on the lines as we're used to from school. But going down the page on each side are the margin lines. Lines designed to keep us from going all the way to the edge. A report or a document will have margins on the top and the bottom and the sides. And likewise in our lives, there's a deep need for us to have that margin, that space in our lives. We cannot go to the end of the line every time and expect to have time to breathe. This morning we pause to explore that margin in our schedules. It's the busyness of our time, our schedules, that is often a result of failing to build in this room to breathe. I believe it becomes the reason so many Americans are overly aching, overly medicating, overly obsessing on WebMD, because their bodies tell them you have to stop. You must slow down. So often it comes back to the lack of margin. Dr. Richard Swinson, who authored the book that is the inspiration for our series, writes of a fascinating history that helps us maybe put in perspective this idea of time margin. He writes that in the 1960s there was a legitimate concern by scientists and futurists that our progress was going to create a significant problem in our society. We were going to have too much free time. In 1967, testimony in a Senate subcommittee predicted that because of our growing efficiency as a society, by 1985, Americans would only be working 22 hours a week and would be able to retire when they were 38 years old. What happened? I don't know. Maybe there's some retiring 38-year-olds or folks that work a full-time job at 22 hours a week, but I don't think so. Somewhere along the way, we ended up efficiently removing all of that space in our lives by sticking more stuff into it. more expectations, more activities, more requirements, more need to achieve. This is the concept that Tilden Edwards speaks of. He says that in our society, in our culture, we find ourselves trapped in a pattern of achievement and escape. The expectation to achieve is so high. We have to buy more things. There are things we want, so we have to work more to get those things in order to make more money, and we're achieving through our possessions. Or maybe we want to achieve a certain level of social standing, so we have to go to events that we don't really want to go to, we don't really have time for, work on projects that wear us ragged all along, losing the margin simply so that we can achieve. So much in our lives is about bowing down to the God of achievement. But eventually we can't do it anymore. We have to stop. Our bodies just wear out. They get too tired. And so, as Edwards writes, we swing to the opposite side of the spectrum and we escape. From achievement, we try to escape. We do it all day long. During the course of the day, we escape into our phones. Don't we? If you don't believe me, look at the traffic light next time and watch how many heads drop as soon as the light turns red. Everybody is escaping in the moment. At night, we escape into our TVs, into lives of entertainment or sports or some kind of distraction. On the weekend, we escape by overindulging in food or drink. And then there's the ultimate escape, a vacation. 2 weeks a year where we get to fully escape and finally be able to do what we need to do to find some peace. I remember a commercial a few years back from some investment firm that had a guy standing there with a life jacket on and a kayaking paddle, and he raised his arms in victory and he said, "Finally, I'm able to relax." And I thought about the profundity of that an investment firm is saying, live a life of achievement so that you can escape from your life of achievement. Isn't there a better way? Of course. Of course there is, and we find it in today's passage in the life of Christ, spoken again and again, words of truth and wisdom. I read today from the passage of Jesus' raising of Lazarus from John 11. Now, I don't want to bury the lead here. Of course, the big picture, the main point of this story is that Jesus raises a guy from the dead. All right? That's the big story you need to pay attention to. But now that we know what that is, I want to draw your attention to this side conversation that is incredibly profound in and of itself. It's this conversation that Jesus and Mary have with one another. It's a powerful exchange that helps us to see what Jesus believes about this idea of margin. So Mary and Martha send word that Lazarus is sick. The exchange is set up in that earlier passage because they have told him the one that you love is ill. They want Jesus to come and do something. It's not explicit, but it's implied. They want him to come. At some level, can we understand what Jesus was going through? How often are there explicit or implicit requests on our time? Expectations laid upon us by others, hopes or outright demands that we use our time in some specific way. For Jesus, the pull must have been great. This was an important family to him, Mary and Martha and Lazarus. These are family friends that he had known for a long time. It must have been difficult to not drop everything and rush to his side. He must have known that he had the power to do something about it, to fix the situation, to make a difference. But Jesus resists that very temptation. He does not drop everything. He does not go. He has a mission that he is currently engaged in, and he will not abort that mission to go do the tyranny of the urgent. This had to be Jesus' quandary most of the time, don't you think? He was always expected, always pushed, always demanded to do something with his time and with his power. It had to be one of the more difficult things about being Jesus, who he served first in any given moment. Everyone he helped, every time he healed somebody, every time he cared for somebody, necessarily there were other people on the outside looking in that were not cared for. There simply were not enough hours in the day for him to do it all. Can we relate? No. Of course we can't relate to the ability to raise a man from the dead. That's a divine power that we don't have. But can we relate to his humanity here? His human limitation that there are only 24 hours in the day and choices must be made. Maybe we can also relate to Jesus' emotion here. He has chosen not to go. He has continued on his mission. He finishes his work in Galilee, knowing that when he goes south to Bethany and Jerusalem, it will be his last trip there. But then Lazarus has died. By the time Jesus arrives, both sisters approach him with the same question: why didn't you come? Martha asks it first, and then Mary the same question. But this second conversation with Mary takes place in front of a group that John calls the Jews, referring to these community members who are there mourning with them. Some of them may be even professional mourners, a part of the culture, those who are being paid to be there. John calls them the Jews. I like to call them the busybodies. Look at the way they interact with Jesus here. They too ask, well, why didn't he show up? But these aren't grieving sisters here. These are people on the outside looking in, judging, busybodies thinking they know what he should have done, poking their noses in where they don't belong, and Jesus gets angry. The Greek does a better job than the English here describing that anger. The NRSV says that Jesus was deeply disturbed in spirit. But the better phrase would be, he was ticked off. He was angry at these people. He was angry at being second-guessed for his choice. He was angry at the power of death to destroy a friend. He was angry in grief over the loss of a friend, knowing that he could have done something to stop it. And yet, in the midst of his humanity, Jesus still shows his divinity. Of course, in the obvious way, he shows it by raising this man from the dead. But more than that, we can see how, as a human, with power and wisdom, he made a choice about what he was going to do with his life, with his time. In the midst of overwhelming expectations and demands, he made a choice. His choice demonstrates the divine power, the divine principle of Sabbath. When we think of this word, we often think of a Sabbath day, right? But throughout his ministry, Jesus created a more meaningful understanding of Sabbath time, a set-apart time that also helped us to be leavening for an understanding of time itself. Norman Wiersbe, in his book, Living the Sabbath, says it this way: we do not wait for one specified day of the week to offer our thanksgiving and praise, even if one day is set apart to shed a critical and corrective light on all our other days. The goal is rather to arrange our schedules, direct our choices, so that they manifest at all times a deep appreciation for the diverse and costly ways of God's grace. At all times. That's what Jesus did. That's how he lived his life. More than a day itself, Sabbath was about a lifestyle of worship and grace. The Lazarus story is a wonderful example. He chose not to bend to the tyranny of the urgent, but instead did what was right at the right time. And this wasn't the exception. This was the rule. Again and again throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus going to the hills to pray, even though the need right in front of him was great to heal and to teach. At that moment, the need to rest and recover was greater. And so we see again and again Jesus being told by the religious authorities what they're doing wrong, how he and his disciples are not observing the Sabbath correctly. But even then, Jesus was teaching Sabbath is not simply about one day, but a recognition that all time is God's time. It is an understanding that all days are holy days, each a gift from God. A Sabbath day is an important leavening agent that reminds us that all time is something we must appreciate. So what's that look like in our lives? What's it look like in your life? I can't say. I can't begin to presume how you must apply these principles to your life, but there are some practical things that we can talk about. Practical suggestions. Last fall, the Finance Committee invited Kathleen Ames Stratton to talk about some very practical time management tips. They're very thoughtful, very wise. Actually, she left us her notes, her handout, and I've made copies. They're in the back. If you'd like a copy of that, take that home. It's some wise ways to think about how we manage our time. But in addition, this morning I would offer just a few suggestions. Some practical words from Dr. Swenson and others about how we might find margin in our schedules. 1, stop bragging about being busy. I do it? Come on, you do it. We all do it. It's part of that achievement-centered lifestyle, isn't it? We talk about being busy in ways that make us sound like victims, but what we're doing is we're really trying to say, look, we're heroes. Because we're so busy, look how needed we are, look how productive we are, look how committed we are. But let's agree today. Let's come together and agree together to call it what it is. When we are overly busy, we are not victims. We are not special heroes. We are failing spiritually. And we need to stop bragging about it, especially at church. We come to church to learn a better way, and that way isn't simply to escape. It's not a place just to escape the achievement-centered world, but it's a place to deny that world has power in our lives. To learn how to deny the value of it and that cycle that traps us in worshiping the wrong things. Stop using busyness as a trophy. 2, schedule Sabbath moments. Again, this is not simply a time to escape or distract. We do that all the time, but instead, schedule a time for margin. Swenson quotes Meyer Friedman, who coined the phrase type A personality. Dr. Friedman suggested that all of us, but especially us type A folks, need to schedule moments to slow down. He says, go to the bank and go stand in the longest line. I actually did this the other day. I read this book and I said, okay, go into the drive-thru, which I know isn't really that much margin, but going to the drive-thru, I went to the longest line and I stopped and paused and said, okay, I'm wasting time, and that's okay. He said, go browse in a bookstore. Go sit in an empty church sanctuary. Go wander through a museum. He had his appointment secretary set up appointments with patients who didn't exist. That way, when he came to that appointment during the day, he would have an hour of margin, or at least an amount of time that he could take a breath intentionally to slow down. Swenson reminds us that's exactly what Jesus did. He was notoriously unhurried when it came to his ministry, when it came to his life. He made a point of planning for that interruption, the unexpected, the quiet moments of prayer. When we plan for these Sabbath moments, even schedule an expectation of these moments, God speaks to us in fresh, new ways. It's not simply escaping. This is disrupting the achievement, escape, death spiral with moments of Sabbath. Finally, number 3, do less to do more. Lazarus' story shows us that we will always have to make choices. Jesus had to make choices, but he made the right choices. Instead of allowing the most urgent need, the most obvious in-your-face problem to overwhelm, he chose to do less in order to do more, to be more fully engaged when he did something. His priorities then became kingdom priorities. Swinson wrote that we need to assess our daily activities according to their spiritual authenticity. Take a look, pull out your phone, look at your schedule. What would your schedule look like if that were your rubric? Thoreau, again, reminds us of this. He says, it's not enough to be busy, so are the ants. The question is, what are we busy about? Yes, what a question. What are we busy about? We will be busy, but what will we be busy about? I would be remiss to not share at least one Martin Luther King Jr. quotation this weekend. In 1964, Dr. King stood before the capacity crowd at Oberlin College and told the students and faculty there these words: "The time is always right to do right." When we do less to do more, we make our priorities from the kingdom, it will be the right time. Of course, there will be hard decisions. There will be many things left unaccomplished. We must deal with that reality. But when we make our priorities kingdom priorities, we find out that much of what keeps us busy is simply that, busy work. Today and in the days ahead, let us be about kingdom work. And let us never tire of doing that work together. Let us pray. Lord, grant us your peace. Grant us your Sabbath even when we do everything in our power to take it away. Even when we try to overwhelm you and your voice and your wisdom with the tyranny of the urgent. Grant us wisdom to set aside that which is not spiritually necessary. And help us to be fed by you in our moments of margin. In your name we pray. Amen.